Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, friends, and comrades from around the globe. My name is Lucia Nimesha, and I'll be co-hosting this webinar with my colleague, Norma Masia Moyo, on behalf of the Environmental Lawyers Collective for Africa and Natural Justice. Today marks the third webinar from ALCA and is titled Beyond the Courtroom, Non-Legal Approaches Towards the Achievement of Environmental Justice. Before I get to the introductions, we have some housekeeping rules, of course. This webinar has interpretation facilities for French, English, and Portuguese. If you need to switch now, please do so. You'll find the button at the bottom right of the screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available in due course. ALCA will also be looking to roll out further webinars in the future, so please look out for those in your inbox. If you have any questions, please make use of the question box at the bottom of the screen, and of course, we welcome any questions from the audience. We will allow some time at the end to go through those questions. We might not be able to get through all of them. However, if there are any questions that you'd like reflections on, please email either co-host. Right, now back to the third webinar. Environmental justice is a subject that expands beyond the legal actions or interventions within the court. Environmental justice is underpinned by a set of principles and philosophies that allows communities and society to tackle the questions of how the environment must be protected, respected, and utilized for the benefit of the world, communities, and society as a whole. Although environmental justice and the law are interconnected closely, today's webinar will expand into the areas of action activities one can take that is not rooted in utilizing the court, but will still lead to environmental justice. To take us through these concepts, ideas, and actions one might take, we have two distinguished guest speakers who have been involved in the fight for environmental and energy justice and holding government and corporations accountable for the unsustainable actions against poor and marginalized and indigenous communities. The first speaker is Bhebhe, who is the director for GroundWork, a regional organization working across Southern Africa. The second guest is Dean Bhebhe, a campaign manager at Powershift Africa, a regional organization working across Africa. Thank you everyone again for joining this exciting event. Norma, over to you.
Thanks so much, Lucian. Hi everyone, and a warm welcome to ALCA's third segment of its 12-part webinar series for 2024. As Lucian mentioned, today marks a special occasion as we come together to explore the theme already highlighted. But before we delve into our discussions, I have some exciting announcements to share with you all about some of ALCA's upcoming activities. First and foremost, we're really thrilled to announce that we're going to be having an upcoming launch of ALCA's website later this month. This digital platform will really serve as a vibrant hub for resources, collaboration opportunities, and meaningful engagement within our community. It's also a space that will be designed to amplify your voices as ALCA members and to foster connections and drive positive change on a much more global scale. In addition to our website launch, we're also gearing up for the Southern Africa Lawyers convening this coming April. This is a gathering that promises to unite legal professionals, researchers, scientists, campaigners, and policy activists who are really passionate about environmental justice and advocacy. It's really an important opportunity to exchange ideas, share insights, and strategize innovative approaches to address some of the pressing environmental challenges that affect the region specifically. Furthermore, I'm delighted to share that we are collaborating with fellow non-governmental organizations on a joint submission to the International Court of Justice regarding state obligations in respect of climate change this month. This initiative really underscores our collective commitment to advancing environmental justice through legal advocacy on a much more international scale. Details of this submission will be highlighted on our website, as well as information about how to support it. So as we embark on today's webinar, let's keep the spirit of collaboration alive. Thank you all for joining us, and let's make today's discussions truly impactful. Back to you, Lucian.
Thank you so much, Norma. So as I said, the first guest speaker is Bhebhe. Bhebhe is the Executive Director of GroundWork Friends of the Earth South Africa. He grew up on the fence lines of South Durban's Engine Oil Refinery. He co-founded the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance, was National Campaign Coordinator for the Environmental Justice Networking Forum, and in 1998, he received the Goldman Environmental Prize for Africa. He was one of South Africa's first National Environmental Advisory Committee members to South African Minister of the Environment. From 2008 to 2012, he was on the International Executive Committee of Friends of the Earth International, the world's largest federation of grassroots organizations fighting for environmental and social justice. Bhebhe is also co-chair on the international board for the Global Green Grants Fund and is a founding board member of the Environmental Justice Fund in South Africa. He advises on various national and international environmental justice strategies, engaging with funders to local fence line activists. He has received an honorary doctorate from the Durban University of Technology, and in December 2020, he was appointed by the President of South Africa to serve on the Presidential Climate Commission. Bhebhe, thank you again for joining us, and it's over to you.
Thanks, Lucian, and thanks, Norma, and thanks, Natural Justice, for organizing this. Essentially, after that blurb from Lucian, I think just I am generally a troublemaker, and I hope that I don't get myself into too much trouble today. So that's how I like to see myself. I'm gonna try and share the screen so that I can share my presentation with you. And in the meantime, I would like to just say hi to Dean. Good being with you again. We were just in Kenya the other day. And yeah, it is nice sharing this platform with you. Let's see if this works. Give me a minute. Great. I assume you can see that. Am I correct, Lucian? You can see the presentation now.
Yes, Bhebhe, it's working.
Fine.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, as Lucian did say, I grew up many decades ago next to an oil refinery, the Engen oil refinery, which was Mobil, and down the road from Mobil was Shell. And I say the word was because over the last 4 years, they closed without announcement, they closed without transition, and they closed without justice. So my experience is one of the harsh realities of the fossil fuel industry. We work across Africa, and in very many spaces we work with Dean, so it's really good to share this platform with Dean. And you will hear about some of the campaigns that inform Beyond the Courtroom in South Africa. Importantly, let's just think about what we are and who we are, and who we are as a group of 35 activists working across Africa and in communities in South Africa and across Africa with the vision to be able to work towards a space where people are living, an earth where people are living with each other and with the earth, and we're living well with each other and with the earth. And that's important. It's about being well with each other. And underpinning that is this process of environmental justice. What we believe on environmental justice is that it's empowered people in relations of solidarity, very important. It's one of solidarity and equity with each other, and in a non-degrading and in a positive relationship with their environments. So I always say, if we work and if we live in solidarity with each other, and if we live with equity with each other, the world will sustain itself. Because it's only when there's no solidarity and there's no equity do we have power imbalances, and we have people suffering and the earth suffering. And it's really important to recognize that we face a very daunting future. We're sitting at 1.55 degrees Celsius presently. We have warned for many decades, GroundWork, that the UNFCCC is failing us, and there's evidence now it's failing us. But we also wrote in 2005 that even if we fail, and I want to quote this directly, and even if the social and justice, environmental justice movements do not succeed against the enormous power of the current regimes, and we do descend into a fossil fuel era of uncertainty and collapse continues, then the spaces of self-reliance and local democracy created through such struggles will emerge as the only viable basis for rebuilding a new world. I think this is very important. We struggle, we're victorious, but we face very big odds. And the world, as we know, we go beyond 1.5. And if we do collapse, what's important about our struggles and our organizing now is that when we rebuild a new world, because we organize democratically and we live with solidarity and equity, rebuilding the new world will really be new. And that's why it's important to organize for victory, not only in how we overcome the crisis we're in now, but how do we rebuild? I'm not going to go over our values and our principles. Those are important for us, especially environmental justice, gender, social, economic justice, and solidarity with communities that suffer environmental justices. And it's important for me to give you this foundation because it gives you a sense of where GroundWork comes from. We campaigners that go to jail, that get arrested with people on the ground, but we also campaigners that seek to engage with governance and push environmental justice and make sure that governance, both at a local, national, and international level, is just. So yes, you know, we disagree with a lot of the processes that happen in terms of governance, and therefore we engage with it to make sure that it is better serving people. And for us, the important thing is about a process of participation. We work with society to strengthen participation, to connect communities. It's really important to connect those that are in struggle, locally and internationally, to power, and to be able to promote and to communicate our expressions of environmental concerns as communities. And I say as communities because we're also part of communities as people, and to be able to find equitable solutions into the problems facing us, and finally to ensure democratic process and gender equity. That's where we come from. But getting to today, I'm going to share the next 4 or 5 slides speaking about beyond the courtroom. So we work with lawyers. GroundWork is one of the founding members of the Center for Environmental Rights. We work with natural justice. We need legal people on our team. We need lawyers. But we don't always, and most importantly, lawyers are not the process that only fights the legal fights in the courtroom. Lawyers need to be part of the campaign, and we need to develop a framework of organizing to make sure lawyers see themselves as that, not only as lawyers, but as campaigners. And how we work beyond the courtroom has always been, and I'm going to give you case studies. In the South Durban area, we worked with the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance in 1995, 1 year after democracy, to get all the communities together that were divided by apartheid, black, white, Indian, colored. In South Africa, we call people of mixed descent colored. And we call people that are of Indian descent, which are South Africans, they're not Indians, but there's a big population of Indian people of Indian descent in South Africa. The apartheid state kept us separately. What the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance did was bring all of those people together under one common banner to share the resources of environmental justice. So that's really important. If we're going to be successful in struggle, we have to do that. We have to build unity. The other part of beyond the courtroom is thinking strategically about how do we work across movements. So Dean works across Africa, and he'll say more about that. But in South Africa, what we have done is we have, as we have developed and worked with the EJ movement building, we have sought to bring in public health professionals, and we work with the Public Health Association of South Africa, with health officials, government, and practitioners to bring the health, environmental justice language to our struggle. But at the same time, we've also struggled and worked with Abashlali Basamanjondolo, the shack dwellers movement in South Africa, to bring their struggles and to understand those struggles as environmental justice struggles. So I often mention an example of when we first interacted with Abashlali and we were worried about the toxic dumps next to which the settlements were being established. The Abashlali senior leadership said, we're not worried about the toxic dumps. We're worried that we don't have toilets. We don't have decent toilets. And quite frankly, we smell the shit that we have to give out because we don't have services. And therefore, we work with Abashlali and other movements on their issues. And so to support the EJ movement, you have to work across struggle. And that's really important for us. And then it's an issue about communications. And for us, communications is important. We work with the Life After Coal campaign, with the Center for Environmental Rights, with Earthlife Africa, South Africa's oldest environmental justice established organization, with movements in Mpumalanga community struggles. And we've created a platform that can articulate good communication on what we want. And so what you have in front of you here is our comms that have communication that has reached far into the struggle in South Africa, to the extent you get headlines in the South African media saying, what is South Africa planning for afterlife, for life after coal? So we coined this phrase in 2016, and we've pushed it, and now it becomes a common phraseology in South Africa. And now we're moving to beyond fossil fuels. And what happens is those good communication processes make sure that people's voices get into the media, people's struggles are seen, and that the legal struggles also get into that communication framework. You have to develop your own evidence. And from day one, working with lawyers, we recognized that we need to develop our own evidence. And the industry, quite frankly, really despise us for that, because we create our own evidence, represent it in the way that we represent it and we want to represent it, and it's not the way they like it. And so we get traction, we push our message by our own evidence, and that has been in our reports. And in the middle here, you see somebody standing with a bucket. We collect our own air pollution samples, and we do our own health studies, and we publish those, and we get them peer reviewed. And so nobody can challenge us. And that's really important, because to be able to demand something with movements, you have to base it on facts. We can't demand something we can't achieve or can never be achieved, or that's not based on fact. And that's the important thing. And then finally, and then I'll hand over to Dean, I think my time is up. Remember, working with lawyers is to have lawyers on tap and not on top. For often the case is that when we work at working with campaigns and lawyers come into it, if they don't come into it sensitively, they end up taking over and people give up their power. And that's why GroundWork and the communities we work with have always articulated position, lawyers on tap and not on top. Thank you, Norma.
Thank you so much, Bobby, for that interesting discussion. As you were sort of going through some of your key points, a lot of things stood out for me. This idea of being comfortable with the pseudo existential crisis of a movement and the conundrum of, facing the reality and the threat that some of these environmental movements might fail. But then this gives us an opportunity anyway to rebuild, I think was really, really important. And then your discussion about campaigners sometimes going to jail and then putting on this dichotomous hat and engaging with governance structures and sort of playing the role of enemy but ally in different sectors this fragile balancing act was also really interesting. And I know a number of lawyers who might do a lot of community engagement work have experienced some of these issues and might want to ask you a few questions about how easy it is or how complex it is to balance that thin line. You also spoke of unity across movements, and how sometimes different movements have different interests. And I love the term you used about working across struggles. So to our participants, please don't be shy. Put in your questions for Bobby in the chat, and afterwards we'll tackle them and we'll see what his responses are. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker's name is Bhebhe. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Witwatersrand and a 2018 Mandela Rhodes Scholar with several years of experience building and implementing campaign strategies across Africa. He currently serves as a dedicated campaigns manager at Powershift Africa, a campaigns lead for Don't Gas Africa, and the coordinator of Kick Total Out of Africa campaign. His work in advocacy involves campaigning for increased investment in renewable energy projects, advocating for the phasing out of fossil fuels, and promoting the use of clean and renewable energy in various sectors of Africa's economy. Through his campaigns, Dean aims to mobilize stakeholders to take action on climate change and to build a more sustainable and resilient future for Africa. He believes that by working together, we can address the challenges of climate change and create opportunities for economic growth and development that benefits all Africans. Please help me in welcoming Dean Bhebhe.
Thank you very much, Nomasano, and everyone for inviting me into this space. And Bobby, it's absolutely fantastic to be speaking in this very esteemed panel with you and in this space with amazing participants as well. And rightfully, as you said, we've been on the road, we've been in Kenya for quite some time, strategizing a lot for Africa in terms of what we need, in terms of climate justice issues. And also, obviously, with the recent dash for gas across the African continent, it was very pertinent to be meeting with a lot of African civil society activists in order for us to strategize for the upcoming year. When I got the invite for this webinar, it was quite difficult really to unpack what I would ideally say, looking at how we can link lawyers into, and looking at the broader spectrum around campaigns. And rightfully, as Bobby said, we have to find a way to bring in lawyers in our different work in terms of climate justice. And it's something that we have been doing, but it can be done quite better. And I think it's very important for such a time as this, where we need lawyers and that background to actually feed into legislation that will be going out in the next few years in our fight for a free and fair, equitable system that is people-centered and people-driven. And I guess in that spirit, we're looking at the idea of achieving environmental justice as a sense of addressing the disproportionate impact of the climate emergency that has had on marginalized communities across Africa or the global South. And in that regard, legal strategies are crucial, and also equally non-legal approaches that play a very vital role in promoting environmental justice. Campaigns on climate justice can play a huge role in supporting legal cases related to environmental issues using several ways. But while these campaigns do not directly influence court decisions, since the courts rely on law and evidence presented in the courtroom, they can, in the broader aspect of things, of a broader context, in which provide some basis in which legal battles are fought or won. And there have been various instances, and I will really try to give those few examples because I think Bobby has really grounded us in terms of why this work is important. So I'm going to do a deep dive in terms of those case studies across the African continent. One way we want to look at it is increased public awareness that can, using campaigns and linking it up with a litigation strategy. And this can lead to greater public support for climate-related legal actions. In this instance, we see spaces where judges and policymakers, while not directly influenced by public opinion, right, operate in a societal context where heightened public awareness can indirectly influence the legal and regulatory environment. Which brings me to a very nice example, to Don't Gas Africa campaign, which is a coalition of over 700 civil society organizations in Africa that are working towards making sure that Africa is not locked in a fossil gas future. And this was initially birthed because in mid-June 2022, the African Union Technical Committee, comprised of energy, infrastructure, and transportation ministers, met and they attempted to propose an African common position on energy access and transition for adoption in 2022. We know that was really ahead of COP27. And the position was really calling for gas, nuclear energy to play crucial roles in expanding energy access in short and medium term across the African continent, and for fossil gas in the short and medium and long term. And as I said, in addition, other avenues of fossils like nuclear, hydrogen. And the proposal was met significantly by strong opposition from African civil society, which fundamentally was the rallying call, the clarion call for the Don't Gas Africa campaign, who then drafted a letter to the African heads of states and ministers. But what is great around this is that when the letter was submitted, there was also a brief that was also submitted to the African heads of states and ministers, where we did take legal briefings from different legal lawyers, and at the same time scientists and also individuals in academia, and we produced this big detailed rebuttal of proposed reliance on fossil fuels. And among those concerns expressed were that the position lacked analysis, evidence, and that would essentially fail to achieve its stated objectives relating to energy access and transition, and undermine Africa's climate objectives and positions holistically. And quite frankly, it was inconsistent with Africa's wider health, human rights, environment, security, democracy, and even developmental objectives. Now, because of that really detailed rebuttal, where we did involve lawyers, we did have scientists, academia, health professionals coming up with that brief that can be found on the Don't Gas Africa website, this position was fundamentally quashed, right? And was rejected by the Africa group of negotiators who actually negotiate on behalf of Africa at the Conference of Parties, or rather through the UNFCCC process. And what's important to highlight there is that was the ripple effect that really started the campaign to grow in terms of impact. And what I want to mention under this, in the spirit of how this can actually build public awareness that can also push and heighten and indirectly influence certain decisions in the regulatory environment, is despite that this was not publicly accepted by the African Union, the AGN did nullify it and quash it, and it has not been adopted officially within the AU structure. So that is good news, a short win for Africa. But also another aspect is it created a ripple effect where we created hotspots across the African continent to try and note where actually there are gas hotspots in terms of countries in Africa that are actually demanding for gas, particularly from the government, and also around the role of corporate capture. We mapped out Nigeria, Uganda, we mapped out Senegal, but particularly it was Senegal that caught our eye, and where I wanted to highlight the point around using campaigns to influence policy. When that happened, in terms of the AU technical paper being quashed, what then was caused was different countries then approaching African countries. So the global north approaching African countries with different instances where they wanted to fund gas investments. And one of those countries was Senegal. And that was actually the first country on the shopping list. And this was being driven by Germany. So what then we did as the Don't Gas Africa campaign was we had to create a case that would be presented in the German parliament, right? Because Germany, I guess, is a democratic country, which is then also governed by a constitution. And we tried to use that avenue of parliamentarians to try and change that said policy and regulatory environment around gas investments by Germany in Senegal in particular. We invited two individuals. So one was a Democrat who actually was for gas, and the other was a Green Party member who was pushing for renewable energy investments instead. We wanted both parties to be present so that when this brief was presented at the German parliament, what it would provide was a neutral ground where it's not necessarily just one individual from the Green Party presenting this or one individual from the Democratic Party presenting a certain position. They both visited Senegal with Don't Gas Africa. We did meet a few members in Barney, in St. Louis. We did meet a few members as well who were working with natural justice during that time as well, along with several other CSOs. And we did community visits. And one thing that came out and one thing that really helped in the long run was that the report was 3,000 individuals were consulted within the fishing communities in Senegal. But when we visited the ground with the German parliamentarians and officials, it turns out no one did that consultation, particularly from the corporate side who are actually pushing to set up those gas plants, and which really created an avenue around accountability and transparency. In short term, a report was produced by both parties. And because we had collated and worked with lawyers and also lived experiences and fed into that report, when it was presented at the German parliament, that decision to actually invest in gas in Senegal was later quashed last year, recently, just before COP28, and which was a major victory. However, we were very short-sighted in that because we were pushing a lot on the Germany-Senegal route, and we neglected one aspect, which is Nigeria, which is also one of the major hotspots. And then just recently, Germany then did push to officially formalize a process, and it's been granted now to have gas investments in the country of Nigeria. But the small win is that, we did pick up one country, we did work and take a legal route and try and influence the regulatory environment, which turned out to be positive. But it also speaks on the need to build capacity across the African continent in order to be tackling issues holistically, because in the instance of Senegal, we won, but we dropped the ball with regards to other African countries. And that is something that we've been trying to correct and rectify as a campaign as we look forward to 2024. Another aspect is looking at how this can really also shift norms. Over time, sustained campaigns can help shift societal norms and legal norms regarding what is considered acceptable environmental behavior for individuals, corporations, and governments. And this can shift and can create a more favorable environment for legal cases related to climate justice. One that really caught my eye and one that we've been trying to link up with regards to the different campaigns is the ecocide legislation, which refers to laws to make a serious harm to the environment, particularly actions that significantly damage ecosystems and have long-lasting impacts, to be criminalized. And this concept has recently been gaining a lot of traction as a crucial tool for advancing climate justice. And it is important because it highlights through the ecocide legislation the impact and the value on accountability, on protection of vulnerable communities, and even the aspect of preventative impact, which is really the existence of that ecocide law being operationalized and it being viewed as a preventative effect that encourages either businesses or even governments to consider the environmental impact of their actions and to more carefully adopt sustainable practices. And this complements, quite frankly, and very nicely, the Kick Total Out of Africa campaign, which is really looking at trying to hold Total accountable for their historical emissions in the continent, and beyond that, also their human rights violations. And because of the ecocide legislation, which under the EU, which also passed an ecocide legislation, we have already one country, which is Belgium, that's already recognizing that, right? But there's a big drive around that. And it is such a time as this, that where campaigns such as Kick Total Out of Africa can benefit from ecocide legislation because it nicely fits into the ideas around accountability and the protection of our of vulnerable communities, and particularly holding corporations accountable. And it's also through that we see a new form of activism or campaigning in terms of semantics or terminologies that are being used. For a very long time, people or individuals and movements and even governments have been using the word mitigating climate change and preventing environmental disasters. Yet the word mitigation actually means that, we are trying to manage emissions. Instead, what we're trying to do is take an action-oriented approach. Instead of mitigating, we're trying to create and push for adaptation to build resilience to unlock developmental pathways within the African continent that mitigating becomes null and void because we are then looking at it at a lens of trying to manage the emissions at a time when Africa is actually trying to avoid emissions. So ecocide legislation is crucial, in campaigns such as DGA, Kick Total out of Africa. And it really establishes that legal accountability and protects vulnerable communities across the globe. We also have got the ICG advisory that is coming up that I also wanted to mention, right? Because looking at the Charter of the United Nations, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and other aspects, including the Paris Agreement, the ICJ has been invited to provide an opinion with respect to climate change. And this is also an opportunity to work with lawyers, with environmental lawyers. There's also an opportunity for civil society organizations, particularly activists and campaigners and campaigns, to feed in and work together with environmental law organizations to create a business case that would really push states to have and realize and respect that we are in a climate emergency and have a certain a position with regards to protecting humanity and the ecosystem under this. So the ICJ advisory opinion comes at a very crucial time where it also provides us an avenue as campaigners and as movements and as activists who work with environmental lawyers to provide those lived experiences that can be incorporated and synergized into those submissions. And I'm happy that Natural Justice are doing one, and it would be very great to collaborate with the different movements across the African continent to feed into something that's very robust, impactful, that also touches on humanity and how humanity have been affected as a result of corporate capture, as a result of the climate emergency itself. We also have to also pay attention to the fact that this idea was also driven by one country, which is Vanuatu. And the reason why I want to bring up Vanuatu is because the different campaigns that we've been operationalizing throughout the years to build upon and pushing back on fossil fuels, it gave birth to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So after years of discussions on climate change and the issue of fossil fuels, it has taken center stage, essentially, and many governments have been given a green light to core oil and gas and jeopardizing the goal of keeping us under the 1.5 threshold. So it's evident that a definitive mandatory strategy is essential to stop the launch of oil and gas projects and to facilitate a worldwide shift from fossil fuels. And the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty does that, and this proposed treaty really aims to enhance and feed on to what's already been agreed on in terms of policy, which is the Paris Agreement, by offering a global blueprint to seize fossil fuel expansion and ensure a fair and just equitable phase out of fossil fuels and establish the groundwork for a genuinely equitable energy system. The other aspect that I wanted to highlight is networking and building in terms of campaigns, bringing together different diverse groups and fostering a network of organizations and individuals who can support each other in various ways, including legal battles. Because for example, the example that I could use here is the Stop ECOP campaign, right? When those students late last year, ahead of COP28, when arrested because of the power of movement building, the power of coalition building and networking, those students got the legal help that they needed as a result of their activism. And that is where we can nicely see that, this network can provide those range of resources from legal expertise to grassroots mobilization. Just to close, because I know my time is almost up, is one of the other aspects that I wanted to also celebrate as a movement is the recently completed United Nations Environmental Assembly in Nairobi, where we saw African nations taking a strong stand against the planet for a new proposed full solution of technologies that could tip an already disrupted climate into new and extreme uncontrollable chaos. And this is through geoengineering. I don't want to really dive deep into it, but what I wanted to mention is that when this was happening, instead, what Africa did at that moment and what campaigners across Africa did was to help our African leaders to actually realize the problem and caution them. And instead, this led to Africa putting the spotlight on the precaution and the need to advance the ban of such full solutions and actually to emancipate the idea around the need to involve more African academia and civil society when it comes to issues around full solutions that really try and tamper with the environment, which is really looking at the different scale of technologies that were going to be used as a way of reflecting the sun back into space. And that resolution was essentially quashed through different campaigns, particular one, which is the Don't Geoengineer campaign, which is housed by the Home Africa Working Group. And instead, there's been a big call on the Solar Non-Use Agreement, which is backed by not only just civil society organizations, but African ministers through the AMSEN decision 15 and 19 that was implemented last year in August 2023. And then finally, in closing, is how we can use campaigns and also environmental lawyers to win the narrative around the right to development. Africa sits at crossroads, and there's a fight to decide its energy developmental future and what is currently playing out within the emerging green global economy. And obviously, the idea is around that we need fossil fuels, for the time being, in order for us to leapfrog towards that promised renewable energy future. And that narrative is essentially wrong, and we need to own the energy narrative and really use those legal terminologies, the ecocide terminologies, the activist terminologies, and the synergized effort to try and strengthen that position, particularly that our advocacy efforts is not about whether Africa has a right to develop. We can all agree that Africa has that right to develop. This is rather a discussion and a position about what the best way for Africa to develop is, one that is not governed by fossil fuels, and also using that avenue to push on how our position is not about whether the global North Africa owes Africa climate debt. We all know and can agree that they absolutely do, and this continues to go unfulfilled. But the unfulfilled promises of rich countries are not a good reason for Africa to pursue self-harming developmental pathways, which is why it's very important for us to also then unpack that idea around the right to development and come up with synergized efforts where we see environmental lawyers, campaigners, and activists coming together to create such narratives. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our speaker, Bhebhe. I think your presentation really makes us think and reflect about how the wheels of justice sometimes turn extremely slowly, and the role of campaigns and movements is to cast a spotlight on very urgent and pressing and concerning projects and activities that pose a threat to our continent and to our biodiversity and environment. I heard you talking about geoengineering, carbon markets. All these things are sort of new launched attacks at our climate, at our environment, and sometimes the law is a lot more slower to react to these sorts of things, and so the work of campaigners is really important. As our speakers were presenting, we noted a couple of questions that came through to us, and it's at this point at our webinar when we're going to tackle some of these questions. I'm going to hand over to Lucien to do that. So back to you, Lucien.
Thank you, Norma, and thank you, Bobby and Dean. It was really great presentations. I think we can resonate with the solidarity, the unity, the different actions going before Parliament. But yeah, as Norma said, the justice wheels turn very slowly, and Africa doesn't have that. So with that noted, we've got a couple of questions. I'll ask to each speaker. If you can, please try and be as brief as possible, because I know we are running out of time. But obviously, make sure that you cover what you want to say. So, Bobby, this question is for you. How do campaigners who willingly face arrest and imprisonment while actively participating in governance at both local and national levels manage the delicate balance between being perceived as both an enemy and an ally simultaneously? And how fragile is that equilibrium that they strive to maintain? Thanks.
Well, I hope I could be quick to answer that. One is, we all are part of governance. Governance does not mean sitting in a room with a person only talking. Governance means participation. What does participation mean? Participation means going to court. Participation means protesting. Participation means doing research and putting evidence on front to the table so that change can be based upon evidence. So I think I don't have a challenge in my mind of doing all of that. And if, yes, I might be arrested in some of that, so be it. I think GroundWork has never, ever been taken to court successfully by industry because we've never, ever put out wrong information or false information. Industry and government does not like the way we present our information and the way we represent it and the way we articulate it through our own lens.
Thanks, Bobby. That was very poignant. Appreciate it. Dean, this question's for you. So in your engagement with parliamentary platforms and efforts towards phasing out fossil fuel, how do you perceive African states' reception of your work? Specifically, to what extent is the advocacy for fossil fuel phase out viewed by African nations as a potential foreign policy threat?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I want to answer. Yeah, that's a big question, eh? I could take 2 hours, but first of all, the problem is our African leaders, to be very frank with you. And some, as if Bobby is laughing, but and that is the honest truth. And the best way to actually put them in check is to cut bait hurts, and which is to close the tap of investments coming into Africa. When you go to the World Bank meetings, for example, and you speak to the executive directors of the different shareholders, be it any country, the response you get when regards to as to why are you not funding fossil fuels? I mean, why are you not funding renewable energy? Why are you funding fossil fuels? Is because our governments are submitting projects that want to be funded through gas and oil, essentially. And so the problem now then becomes a public finance issue, which is why we try and our best to work with individuals that actually can help shift public finance away from fossil fuels and into renewable energy. But however, we've been quite frankly also working with African leaders as well. Because as I mentioned, through the Don't Gas Africa campaign, there was a decision that was made to quash that common position late in 2022. And that was a decision that was made through consulting environmental ministers. But it doesn't also help where we see an instance where this common position was adopted by energy and transportation ministers without consulting climate change envoys or environmental ministries and climate change ministries. So there's actually a big gap between those three individuals or three bodies of work. And it becomes quite difficult to holistically tackle that. But what I can say is one strategy is the shareholder strategy, where we're looking at where the money is and trying to shift that investment in order to change minds and also to produce evidence-based approach around why it is viable and financially affordable to push for renewable energy in comparison to fossil fuels. But there's a wider aspect to this. There's corporate capture, there is the role of Africa Energy Chamber, and I can go on and on about this, but I know we're out of time, so I'll give it back to you, Lucian.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks, Dean. So Bobby, the next question I have for you is, how can individuals within the environmental justice movement reconcile the acceptance of a pseudo-existential crisis, embracing the reality and potential failure, while simultaneously viewing it as an opportunity for positive transformation and rebuilding? And I know this is also, again, a very heavy question.
Yeah, but there's also a very simple answer to this. People on the ground, and I'm going to go on record about this, people on the ground care. Maybe I must be careful on the words I use. People don't care about climate change, quite frankly. A person living in a shack settlement doesn't care about climate change and does not care about the jargon that us NGOs throw around. What people on the ground want, and this is why we can deal with the crisis quite effectively, what people on the ground want is good services. They want water, education, transport, health services, food, clean energy that does not harm them. That's what every government promises every citizen. But the comprado nature of our governments, i.e. green hydrogen for Germany, rather than green hydrogen for oneself, that comprado nature of our governments results in our governments not delivering services to people. So we can get through this crisis by asking our governments, what are you doing? Not what is Germany doing, not what is the UK doing. What are you doing, Angola? What are you doing, South Africa? An effective service delivery to build a resilient community, a climate just community that is going to be able to deal with the chaos of climate change.
Thanks, Bobby. Yeah, completely agree. Absolutely. Dean, this question's for you, and then I think I'll have one more. I have time for just one more question after that, but I'll open up to both of you to answer at the end. So Dean, you highlighted significant issues surrounding manipulated reports, driving projects forward in Africa, and the lack of adequate consultation with impacted fishing communities in Senegal, for example. In light of these challenges, how much of your advocacy work feels like navigating a constant game of cat and mouse?
I mean, that's exactly what it is. It's cat and mouse, it's essentially, which is why even before I finished, I was like, we need to be building more in terms of movements, in terms of campaigns, in terms of capacity across the African continent, because it's a cat and mouse game. It's a constant chase, right? And we need a unified, people-centered building power, building movements in order to tackle and have something feasible. So yes, it has been tough, essentially. But with the different campaigning strategies that have been ongoing, we've been quite successful. I mean, we have audited through Global Citizen, for example, and been collecting different actions for Don't Gas Africa. And since that campaign has started, it's been almost 2 years now. I think it's going to be 2 years in June. We've had over 51,000 actions across the African continent, and that is not just hashtags. It's not hashtags. There's actually the number of people who've either marched, submitted a letter to government, done a community gathering of sorts. So it's got nothing to do with the digital aspects of it. And that goes to show that we are building power, we are building movement. And at some point, it's going to give. I mean, we are living in a world where we finally have transitioning away from fossil fuels on a global UNFCCC text, and that might mean something. It's a stepping stone towards a positive direction. So that idea around cat and mouse might just be nullified, and we might have some real work, but we still have a long way to go as a movement. But there is light at the end of the tunnel, because we now live in an age where things that were never mentioned in the last 30 years are now being mentioned now, and that is progress.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, access to information has just become such a huge issue, and it's growing, like you said, on the African continent. Thanks for that, Dean. So I suppose the last question is one oriented around corrupt governance, but specifically the judiciary. So we obviously talked a lot about legal intervention, but noting that there are judiciaries that are not as well functioning as in South Africa, for example. Can we achieve environmental justice without legal action? And I'll open up to both of you. Thanks. Whoever would like to go first.
This is a very wide question. No, the answer, simply put, is no. We cannot pursue environmental justice without legal action. And you see, the idea around environmental justice, or the idea around justice, it goes beyond just tackling, climate change or the climate emergency. It's about service delivery, as Bobby put it. It even goes beyond that. It's a holistic version of what it means to be humans and what it means to respect life. I can even bring the idea around the genocide in Palestine right now. If we don't, as a movement, come together for the Palestine, the Palestine genocide, we are not going to win the climate movement. Because essentially, if we fail to convince leaders to value human life in that regard, how are we then meant to use the examples around climate justice issues and also pinning it on the respect for human life to achieve action? Which is why we need the legal actions, which is why we need law in order for us to drive that change. So it's a holistic aspect of how we want to look at how we understand environmental justice and these issues. Again, the question is very wide, and I could go on and on again, but I think Bob is quite eager to also provide a response, so I'll pass it on to him.
No, you can go on. So just very quickly, the issue around the just transition is about delivery and changing the way society works. It's about a systemic change. And to be able to get that systemic change, we need to mobilize for it. We need to demand it. We have to put evidence there. And then we need the lawyers to write the law in. I can't write law, but I can speak to the lawyers, be that at Center for Environmental Rights or Natural Justice. I'm on the phone with them. I say, this is what I want, do it for me. And they put it into legal language. And then they put it into law. So that's important. To be able to get systemic law, you have to have the legal people involved. But the legal people need to be involved from the beginning. So you can't bring legal people in on the end of it. And I think that's important. That's part of the puzzle piece. And finally, I want to say, and Dean, thank you for raising the issue of Palestine and the issue of so many other genocides around the world, so many other spaces of violence, the DRC, where millions have lost their lives, but it's not spoken about. So for us in South Africa, as the Life After Coal campaign, we've developed the open agenda for the just transition, on the just transition with communities, and it's an open agenda. And part of our change in this agenda, as we are speaking and talking now, is about how do we add a process of demilitarization in the world that be a component of our just transition? Because we will always have violence if we continually build up the type of violence response through militarism in this world. Palestine is not needed. You know, Eastern DRC is not needed. South Sudan is not needed. We can talk through those issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both our speakers, Dean and Bhebhe. This Q&A session was really interesting, made me think that maybe we need to do a part 2 of this theme. There's too much to talk about and discuss in just under an hour. Honestly, sometimes feels like maybe we haven't done enough justice to the issues, but I hope that we've clarified a few things. On behalf of ALCA and Natural Justice, I'd really like to extend a heartfelt vote of thanks to everyone who made it to today's webinar and made this a really enriching experience. First and foremost, again, a sincere appreciation goes out to Bhebhe Peak and Dean Bhebhe. Your expertise, passion, and commitment to environmental justice has really illuminated our discussions and inspired us all, I hope, to think beyond the courtroom. A special acknowledgement is also due to the co-chair of this webinar, Lucien Limacher, whose leadership and dedication has been really instrumental in shaping today's event. So thank you, Lucien. We also extend our gratitude to the interpreters and technical team behind the scenes whose tireless efforts have really ensured a smooth communication and seamless execution of our webinar. Last but not least, we express our heartfelt thanks to each and every attendee who joined today. Your active participation and thoughtful questions were really the driving force behind our collective efforts. And together, we're really making a difference. So until next time, it's goodbye for now from ALCA and NJ. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.